This country is getting older. Americans 50 and older are now a third of the population, up from 1/4 in 1960. Baby boomers are no longer the largest demographic group. That would be millennials, who were born from 1981 to 2000. Millennials are now 27% of the population, boomers 24%. We still slightly outnumber Gen Xers, who are about 21%. What does this mean? It means that no one demographic group is setting the tone for all others. It means that power is almost equally dispersed, or rather, the demographics are almost equally dispersed. Power is another thing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The percentage of unmarried voters is something that has gone largely unnoticed and is rarely discussed. In 1974, 70% of eligible voters were married, 30% were unmarried. Now the split is almost 50-50. 52% married, 48% not, reflecting the fact, as many of you know, that many people marry later or not at all, or dissolve their marriages at some point. And what you might not have noticed is what Samuelson called the gap between voters and the rest of the population. In 2012, slightly more than a quarter of voters were minorities. That's a fraction of the share of the population, which is now almost 40%. So what you have is a situation where a minority is making decisions for the majority with whom they do not necessarily see common cause. And when has that been a recipe for social harmony? Let's get back to that racial issue. In a lot of cities and towns, we can all look around and see how the country is changing. But what you might not know is how much and how fast. You might know that in 1980, 80% of the US population was white, or considered itself white, let me put it that way. Now, it is 63%. By 2060, the white population is expected to be 44%. African Americans will remain about 12 to 13%. Asian Americans, and I apologize for this, that's how it is in the survey, others, are projected to double from 8% of the population now to 15%. Meanwhile, Latinos have gone from 6% of the population in 1980 to 17% now, and are projected to reach 29% by the year 2060. Now let's talk about that part. Because one of the things we often don't notice is we use these broad sweeping terms, but even within these groups, there are wildly different variations, wild diversity that we hardly even acknowledge or even discuss. I mean, according to the Pew Research Center, the Latino population has increased sixfold since 1970, but this is not a monolithic group of people. The demographics vary wildly depending on where they came from and when they came. For example, Hispanics, Latinos of Mexican origin have a median age of 25, compared to people of Cuban descent with a median age of 50. Did you know that 51% of Venezuelan immigrants have a college degree? That is a larger percentage than the general population. That's compared to 7% of people from El Salvador or Guatemala. Now, in his column, this is how Robert Samuelson saw this complexity. He said, this is part of what explains the political paralysis in Washington. It's not, as the partisans would have it, necessarily Republican obstructionism or President Obama's arrogance, but to the fact that, quote, both parties have had a hard time creating agendas that appeal across ideological, racial, and ethnic lines. There's been a fragmentation of power and purpose that transcends the defects of political leaders. Now, he goes on to give a dire warning. He says the central problem of American governance is how to create a political system that advances the nation's long-term interest, even though politics may be dominated by groups pursuing their short-term self-interest. Power may derive from the people, but it has to be tempered, in Samuelson's words, in ways that allow for the future. This is a challenge every generation faces, and one, he says, that we are arguably failing, unquote. But that is why it is so important to bring the outsiders in, because they are already here. We cannot deny the truth of our eyes. We could, but where is it getting us? This is, in my view, why we have to talk about this. When I and my colleagues started Tell Me More, our agenda was not to sit around staring in the mirror and congratulating ourselves on being diverse, but rather to create a place and space to talk about how this country is changing and how it affects all of us. Now, I'm not going to go and rehash NPR's decision to cancel the program, which I've made clear I regret and disagree with. But you might note that the New York Times similarly just decided to redeploy a correspondent who is also doing similar work. And I find it fascinating that the decision to focus on these issues as a coverage area comes and goes in the so-called mainstream media, the legacy news media. But we have all kinds of shows that focus on technology. We have all kinds of shows about changing your house and rearranging your house and how to throw out all your old stuff and what's in your closet, but remarkably little discussion about who is living in this country and what we all want and don't want and how we should proceed in an era when there is not one dominant lifestyle or value system dictated by one ethnic group or generation. This is puzzling to me. It is also interesting to me that the entertainment media is taking all this on. Why is there more diversity on Scandal than there is on the evening news? The future is here now, and if we continue to refuse to allow for a language that allows us to acknowledge these differences in the real world and not just in TV land to figure out how to talk about these issues, I don't know what we're going to do. Now, I'm not an expert on this, but I will submit that that is one of the reasons I am both a journalist and a talk show host. Now, I'm dating myself here, but one of my favorite quotes is from the biography of Russell Baker, whom some of you will remember was a much-loved columnist for the New York Times, and he wrote a wonderful memoir called Growing Up, about when he was a rookie reporter trying to peel some information from a desk officer who didn't feel like giving it to him, and one of the crusty old sergeants rolled by and asked what was happening, and when he heard, he finally told the other guy, he said, "Give the kid what he wants." Not telling him about it didn't make it unhappen. I don't know about you, but it seems that too often that there is a default about not talking about the changes we see in front of us, and somehow not talking about it is going to make it unhappen. Or to put it another way, perhaps there is a default that minimizing differences instead of acknowledging and working through them is somehow in the service of unity. But what I find instead is that we mistake capitulation and domination for negotiation. What I find instead is a tendency to try to subsume a lot of people's truth in the service of a few people's fictions about the world. What I find instead is a willingness to ignore a lot of people's pain in the service of a few people's peace of mind. I don't think that's peace. I don't think that's truth. I don't think that's productive. Now, thank you, I'll take that. Now, do I think we need to sit around all day picking at each other's ancient wounds? I do not. I fully recognize that that is exactly what some people think journalists do, and that is exactly why they don't like us very much. Nor am I advocating that we really engage in an endless game of competitive suffering, where everybody competes over their victim status. I don't believe in that either. But what I am talking about is getting serious about noticing the truth of our world and having some actual conversations about how we want to face the future. I hold all of us responsible. I don't think it's just Mr. Obama's responsibility or Mr. Boehner's responsibility or Mr. McConnell's or Mrs. Clinton's. It is all of ours. We can all have necessary conversations, hard conversations as necessary.